Hello, my name is David Ades. I'm a poet based in Sydney and the host of a monthly poetry podcast reading series called Poets Corner, in association with WestWords in Parramatta in Sydney's West. WestWords is Western Sydney's literature development organisation. Poets Corner is part of WestWords' public programming that celebrates the richness, diversity and insight that literature offers. Especially in these times, we thank the ongoing support of Create New South Wales, the Cultural Fund of Copyright Australia, City of Parramatta Council, Blacktown City Council, and Campbelltown City Council, as well as the many project partners that have enabled us to continue to provide opportunities to writers and audiences. We hope that this new world will see us sharing and a closeness of spirit. Each month, I invite a poet to read poems and talk about them around a theme of the poet's choice. Our guest poet today is Anne Kellas, who will be reading poems and talking with me on the theme of silence and the space between. I'm recording this from Beecroft in Sydney. Anne is recording from Tasmania. I'd like to pay my respects to and acknowledge the elders, past, present and emerging, of the Walleah people, the traditional custodians of the land in Beecroft, and to acknowledge also that they are the sovereign owners of their land, which has never been ceded or given up. I also acknowledge the Tasmanian Aboriginal people as the traditional custodians of Tasmania, and acknowledge and lament the loss of the Muwinina people in Hobart, Nipaluna, as well as the strong impacts of colonisation on all of Aboriginal Tasmania. I acknowledge the determination and resilience of the Palawa people of Lutruwita, Tasmania, who have survived invasion and dispossession and continue to maintain their identity, culture and rights. Anne Kellas lives in Nipaluna, Hobart in Tasmania. She's lived in England and Swaziland, emigrating to Australia in 1986, along with her husband and 2 young sons. She has 4 collections of poetry, the most recent of which is Ways to Say Goodbye, published in 2023 by the Melbourne-based Liquid Amber Press and released to much acclaim. Her 3rd collection, The White Room Poems, written with the support of an Australia Council grant, was published by Ralph Wessman's Walleah Press. It deals largely with the drug-related death of her youngest son and was shortlisted in the Tasmanian Premier's Literary Awards. Her 2 earlier books, Isolated States and Poems from Mount Muno, have been translated in their entirety into Ukrainian for a future bilingual publication by the Ukrainian poet Hanna Yanovska. In 1994, Anne and her husband, photographer Giles Hugo, co-created and curated one of Australia's various first online zines, The Right Stuff. In 2004, Anne established a small literary press based in Tasmania called Roaring Forties Press. Anne has become a well-respected poetry mentor and poetry workshop facilitator in Tasmania. She also assesses manuscripts, occasionally reviews books, and has taught poetry at tertiary level. Hi, Anne, and welcome to Poets Corner.
Hello, David, and thank you so much for inviting me to this lovely venue of yours.
Now, you'll be reading poems today from your latest book, Ways to Say Goodbye. I want to start by, as I always do, by asking you about your theme, silence and the space between. I want to look at the 2 components of the theme separately, and then what you mean when you combine them. So there are many kinds of silence. Are there particular kinds of silence that your poetry interrogates?
I think the poems arise out of silence, and it's a way into writing. So instead of confronting a blank page, I confront the silence and I wait and see, and it's almost a meditative process. But then in the writing, the silence can be in between, the spaces in between the lines, between the stanzas. So it's a listening and a way of paying attention.
Now, I was thinking of silences. There are all kinds of silences. You know, there are historical silences. There's the silences of people who retreat within themselves and don't communicate. You don't know what's going on. There's the silence of those who have passed. Are all those silences part of what you're looking into?
Oh, well, definitely, especially after the death of our younger son. a new kind of silence entered our lives. And I discovered a beautiful quote, and I at last found the source. It's a French poet, and he said, poems are a place where nothingness comes to be, where nothingness comes to breathe. So that is partly the answer. And I suppose another way I see silence in poems is, as you would in a piece of music, those musical pauses, intervals, where the register shifts. So it's a multiple thing, and it's also the white space. Especially in the White Room poems, I was intrigued by how a poem can take shape through its white space as much as through its words.
I've always had a sort of complicated relationship with silence, I guess. It's always struck me as ambiguous and unyielding. For me, it's ambiguous because it's capable of being interpreted in so many different ways. You know, what does this silence mean? And it's unyielding because it gives nothing away. I mean, at its heart lies, for me, lies mystery. And that is often what lies at the heart of poems too. Is that part of what drew you to investigate silence in your poetry?
Yes, definitely. I think I agree with you about that ambiguity in the silence. And it's easy to misinterpret or to add interpretations to it, but it's definitely a mystery that I explore, that the poem begins and then I'm not too sure where it's going to go. That's the mystery that unfolds.
You said that you write silence is something that helps you to write. You enter into the silence in order to create the poem. Has that always been the case for you? Is that something that's evolved?
I think it's evolved. I've tried so many different ways of writing. Sometimes I used to do a lot of journaling and take little bits from the journal writing, but I don't do that very much anymore. I tend to just believe that as I begin to write, something will happen on the page. I was interested in listening to Anthony Lawrence's podcast where he said he begins with a line. And in a way, I get that as well. I start with something and then it wanders off and I follow it.
Who's leading the poem?
I try to let the poem lead eventually. Once I can sink into it and trust that voice that it is. I don't follow the poem if it's a bitter voice or an angry voice. So it depends what's leading me. If it's a kindly place, I stay there, and if it's not, then I go on somewhere else.
Where you want to be led, is it?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Now you've mentioned a little bit about the space between. Did you want to amplify that a little bit? Because there's lots of spaces between, isn't there?
Yes. I think our poems are better when we don't fill in every single gap. It's not a case of being a story writer where you have to explain everything. And quite the opposite might be so. Robert Bly has said that what we've lost in English poetry over recent times is the ability to free associate. And he points to the Spanish poets for their what he calls leaping poetry, where they allow themselves to free associate so much, and to do that you leap over so much unsaid. So that is something I'm trying to accomplish these days.
I mean, the space between feels to me like it's an opening. It's something that you can wander into, you can enter, and then you don't necessarily feel it, but it sort of manifests itself in the structure or the language or the shape of the poem. In our sort of exchange of emails before today, you talked about the space, a bunch of spaces, the space between reader and poet, the space between imagination and reality, and the space between lines and stanzas, being in a state of mind where you can allow nothingness to come to be, about writing the invisible, about entering a land you don't know, about entering a kind of language at the point of disappearance. You had a lot of thoughts about this, didn't you, about the gulf between never and eternity? And I thought also, you know, poetry is kind of like the space between the articulate and the inarticulate, where language enters, but it doesn't necessarily tell you everything. Like you say, you maintain sort of space for the reader to go.
Yes, and that language can be a very other kind of language. I very much have to be very alone when I write. So in terms of it being a space between me and the reader, I consciously don't think of the reader as I write. The space between me and the reader opens up when I'm in the revision phase, because that is when I'm striving to allow the reader into the poem. But in the composition stage, the space between is between me and the page, definitely not between me and the reader. So I could shrivel up with self-consciousness if I think of my reader, who that might be. Even if I think of the ideal reader, it has to be a very solitary, lonely occupation for me. That's the way into it.
And you say that you do a lot of revision.
Yes.
So part of that is, I suppose, a lot of your sense of where you want the poem to go with the reader.
Yes, I'm aware that sometimes you put words down and they're like placeholders. So I try to work at a poem phrase by phrase. I heard a lovely series of talks between Clive James and Stephen Edgar many years ago on Radio National. And Clive James said that for him, working on a poem, everything came down to the level of the phrase. And so in the revision stage, I try to take the poem phrase by phrase and see how it unfolds, whether I've just put a word there as a placeholder for something that I really wanted to say that I might not have. And that business of trying to revise a poem to get to what you really wanted to say leads me to another kind of silence, which is an invisibility. Thomas Transtromer said that to him, behind every poem, there is an invisible poem that the poet wants to write, and any translator of that poem, as they translate it, is also trying to get to that same invisible poem. And so there's this feeling that the poem isn't done until you've got as close as you can to that approximation of the poem that you want it to be. But of course you never really quite get there. It's it's an impossible task, and
It is an impossible task.
somebody said poems will never finished but abandoned.
That's right. They never finished.
That was such a liberating statement when I came across it. Auden, I think it was.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about Thomas Transtromer's idea in our exchange of emails about, you were talking about a whole range of other themes that you were thinking about. You mentioned that silence in the space between overlaps or interacts with or encompasses a range of those themes, including grief, the idea of voice, the idea of the invisible poem, the idea of pentimento you mentioned, where the layering and covering over of lines by new lines in the process of revision means that poems accrue meanings and shades of meanings as they are revised, and also the idea of ekphrasis that inspires some of your work. Did you want to say something about how all those ideas inform your understanding of silence in the space between?
Yes, well, I'm fascinated by pentimento, the painting over, the artist making a turn and changing their mind. And I think that this can very much happen with a poem. And a poem that one struggles with for years, it might very well need that process of pentimento to happen to it in order to get to where it needs to be. I wasn't so aware of my interest in ekphrasis until I started putting ways to say goodbye together, and then I realized how many of my poems respond in some way to art. And I suppose if I'd had another kind of life, I might have ended up being an artist rather than a poet. So I'm very much drawn to the visual art aspect in poetry. I can see a strong link between what the painter and what the poet are aiming for.
So you've become an artist with words.
Yes, that I think I had a poem in Isolated States at the beginning that said, "Because I can't paint, I use words."
You've also mentioned to me that Ways to Say Goodbye, which you'll be reading from in a moment, was written under the influence of reading Wallace Stevens. Can you tell us something about that influence and how it affected the writing of the book?
I just found his way of speaking rather obscurely and obliquely, and at times crazily, and yet so in such a controlled manner. Absolutely fascinating. And I couldn't figure out how he did it. Sometimes I look at a poet and I think, how did they achieve that effect? But his poetry over the years morphed into this pure form. So I just immersed myself in him for a couple of years. At that time of writing some of these poems or putting the book together, that helped me polish, I suppose, the poems and allow them in.
All right, shall we read one?
This poem's towards the end of the book, and it's a place to begin our discussion because it gives the context for much of the book. As you left home one winter's night, it's dawn, but it's dark. Winter, your winterreiser, begins, but you don't want to wake. I tried to wake you, but you wouldn't. Then you would. If I knew then what I know now. But there was the ticket, the passport. Your father's ready. Names and numbers, labelled luggage. The car is idling outside. It's dawn, but dark. It's winter here, but summer where you're going. I've bought you coats and bags and clothes and phones and all the usual clutters jammed and folded. You turn back to sleep. No, wake up, I urge you, and you do. Reluctantly, you dress, foot heavy. Swallow today's pills. What if I never see you again? The thought occurs but does not stay. What if I were travelling too? I could, but don't. I'm your taxi, fate's unwilling Charon, your ferry across the Derwent, to deeper waters than you've ever known. And then you're gone. Your plane's a red dot slowly blinking in the sky. Your brother and I drive home as blank as owls. Your silence is everywhere around us. Nothing's left behind, except a woolen jumper. I'll post it to you for Switzerland, and I buy a card. Life is all it says. But I lose it with my wallet. When they're found, I wrap life up in the jumper. Life could reach you in a week before you get to Europe. But it'll be summer there, and still I do not post it. At a point of no return, small as an exclamation mark's full stop. In Zurich's Needle Park, cleaned up almost, but not quite. You punctuate your life. And you don't want to wake.
You mentioned that this gives context to this book, and you also told me that it's a bridge to your previous collection, the White Room poems. Do you want to say something about that?
Yes, I think sometimes we continue conversations in previous books, in our subsequent books. And as I put this one together, I thought, gosh, that should have been in the White Room poems. Oh, that should have been in the White Room poems. That belongs in the White Room poems. And yet they're different. The White Room poems was a much more immediate response to our son's death. This is a more abstract response, I suppose I could say.
Mm.
So the poems after that I'll read after this one are, in a sense, more abstracted. Abstract.
And I noticed the word silence appeared in this poem, and in fact, it appears 15 times in the book. I don't know if you know that, but I counted the word, all the silences,
Right.
which sort of dovetails in with your theme. As a parent, this poem resonated very strongly with me. The line, "If I knew then what I know now," is so poignant, and to use Walt Whitman's words, contains multitudes. But at some point, though, every parent understands that the time is reached when they have to let their children follow their own paths. So if you knew then what you know now, would anything have changed?
Probably not. I don't know where life would have gone, how it would have been different. I suppose things took on a kind of inevitability, inescapability. One felt trapped in a situation, an impossible situation. I think our son might have felt that way too. It's very hard to answer that question.
I know. And I mean, even if you have prescience, can you stop a path from taking its course, as it were? It's hard. And when I read a poem, there's some lines like that, and that jump out at me. And I thought the lines, "I've bought you coats and bags and clothes and phones and all the usual clutters jammed and folded," jumped out at me because it encapsulated the whole mother-child relationship in 2 lines. I mean, it's very economical. It just goes straight to the heart of it. Did those lines almost write themselves, or are these
They did.
Yeah.
I was in a workshop with Robin Rowland, and she got us to write something about a journey. And I virtually wrote the poem on the spot. I never write poems in writers' workshops, but that one just arrived.
Yeah. There is a sense through this poem, by the repetition of winter and dark and the not wanting to wake, that these thoughts are swirling and repeating in the narrator's head. That although there is, as you put it, a point of no return and an exclamation marks, full stop, and a physical end to the poem and the thoughts underpinning it do not end. Is that something of what the poem is trying to convey?
Yes, I suppose it is. In terms of the prologue, I think epigraph at the beginning, I'd used a Wallace Stevens line from a conversation he had with another poet, that most art is created out of a condition of winter.
Mm.
And these poems are created out of a condition of winter.
Mm.
And so the condition is pervasive, whether the poem ends the feeling or not.
The line, "What if I never see you again," haunts this poem. It's a haunting line. Can you ever reach a point where you're not haunted by this thought?
Grief travels in circles rather than in a linear progression. So you're never really not haunted by it, no. Just haunted differently, and you cope differently.
I'm interested in the border between waking and sleeping. The idea that perhaps we're all sleepwalking through life, or life itself is a dream or a nightmare or something, and the sense that sometimes we're swept along by currents we have no control over, as if volition is submerged beneath those currents. I'm not sure if you intended it, but something of that comes across to me in this poem. Does that make any sense to you?
Oh, that borderland between waking and sleeping, yes. And the undercurrent that our lives are taking that we're unaware of is definitely something I'm aware of in the writing. Yes.
All right. Well, you've introduced the theme, silence, with this poem. Did you want to read another one?
I almost call this book a document of clouds. To pin down something as invisible as light was doomed, you'd think. Something so loosely bound with threads of night, foxed edges dissolving into motes. Yet here it was, a document of clouds. I'd been afraid of entering their atmosphere in case I reached the evaporation point of cloud. Cloud, not the cloud world of shipping containers and the loading of documents to and fro, but the free space above. I wanted to see through them, those large floating lenses looking down on us. I wanted to know how it felt to be completely oblivious, blind to the human condition, to understand. It would be enough just to understand. In between their halting rhythmic lines lay the sorrow plain, an area of thin blue, ordered but wild, not tied to scale or key. Below, the dry hands of trees stretched for 1,000 miles. The spiral-bound forest gardens brought to mind the failed idea of kings.
So you almost called this book a document of clouds. Why didn't you?
In a way, I feel I haven't finished writing the document of clouds.
Okay.
So I think there's still a document of clouds to write.
Okay.
Yes. And then one day when I was umming and ahhing about the title, the phrase of ways to say goodbye came to me as a way, as an umbrella term to hold very disparate poems together.
It is a recurrent motif in the book. I think I counted 19 clouds in the book.
More clouds than silence.
More clouds than silence. There you go. I gather from all that this is a significant poem for you. Can you tell us what makes it so significant?
It's actually a physical document. It's a book that I can't write in, that someone bought in Switzerland and gave to me to write in, but it's beautiful handmade paper, and it is very soft and loosely bound. And I feel to write my son's story, it would be perfect to write in, but it's impossible to write in that book. So that was the origin of the poem. Just watching clouds, imagining traveling with them. I have another poem in the White Room poems called Journey to My Son, about imagining his face in the clouds. It's another world that we are so busy with our ordinary lives we often don't see anymore, and yet also that world is changing due to climate change. So you could go many places with the idea of cloud.
And what do clouds have a particular significance in your poetry?
They just arrived in this particular book as a motif.
For me, this poem seems to touch on a lot of different ideas, and you know, I've teased a few of them out, which I'll just mention, and then you can tell me whether I'm on the track or whether you have other ideas that you'd like to elaborate on. I've thought of the ephemeral nature of life, of our lives as transient as clouds, the idea of ascension, of rising above and transcending the human condition, the fear of disappearance, the evaporation point of cloud, perspective, looking down from a great height, the striving for clarity, searching for meaning, trying to make sense of the incomprehensible, which eludes sense, and escaping from the rawness of emotion and grief, which you talk about wanting to be completely oblivious and blind to the human condition. There are all sorts of things that I've teased out of the poem. Are those all things that you intended, and there are other things too?
Absolutely, yes. Thank you for your close reading. Is I can't explain the sorrow plane. That is the strata of being in grief.
And what do you mean by the failed idea of kings?
Just looking down on this fairy tale landscape where you see a little, if you're flying over Europe, you see these little toy villages and perfect little churches, and it's the past, and it's when history was so different, and fairy tales had kings and queens and princesses.
Okay, that's interesting.
I
thought it might have been about the idea of dominion and how in the end it just doesn't matter because we all move on anyway.
Well, that too. Is there
anything else you wanted to say about this poem?
That's being afraid of reaching the evaporation point of cloud, just that mystery that they have, that other life they seem to lead. That would be the fascination for me.
Okay. Would you like to read another one?
Well, one written at the same time as that, called Chiaroscuro. I could see you lying in a darkened room. A woman in Japanese robes, patterned, two-dimensional like cards, heavy as steel armor, guarded you as you slept. She hushed me and kept me from touching your ice-white face. It was your fear I had wanted to visit, but it had left you as soon as you slept. Where, I had wanted to ask, were you travelling? High, you said, high, higher than clouds you can see. I'll be dreaming there, don't you worry. I left you then, believing those thin lines were taut enough to carry you down, or was it up through the thermals? Where you went, no one followed.
So I want to start with the title. It's a beautiful word. What work is that title doing in this poem, Chiaroscuro?
Well, it leads us into this dark place, an ambiguous place, a place of shadow. There was this very stylized vision I had of this woman in Japanese robes, patterns, two-dimensional like cards. So the chiaroscuro arrived. I tried calling it something else, but chiaroscuro stuck.
Mm. It's the interplay between light and shade, isn't it?
Yes, I find titles. I write right at the end. I don't start with a title. I know some people do, but I feel the title has to be part of the poem. It's not an eyebrow added on. So it definitely sets up a mood for the poem.
Mm. Sometimes the hardest thing to write, isn't it? The
It
title.
is, yes.
Yeah. I'm struck by the idea in this poem of wanting to visit someone else's fear. Can you elaborate on that?
I was hoping you wouldn't ask me that because I can't. Like, why was it your fear that I'd wanted to visit?
Yeah.
Maybe it was wanting to comfort somebody in fear. Maybe it's wanting to address a fear, confront the fear. But then the fear's gone.
Yeah, because I wondered whether or not someone else's fear is a mirror of our own.
Yes, yes, yes. So in a way, am I speaking to myself?
Mm.
And sleep's an escape from fear.
Mm.
Mm.
Yeah. Look, I've been thinking a lot about the last lines in the poem. Where you went, no one followed. The obvious and easy interpretation of those lines is that it's about death. But I was thinking it's equally about life, isn't it? We can't follow people into their thoughts or dreams or when they retreat into themselves. That there is so much of others that is hidden from us. Is that what these lines are alluding to?
It's both of those. So it's yes, it's the obvious one about you can't follow somebody who's died. But it is this person off on an adventure as if they're going to be a skydiver and go up or down the thermals, and I can't follow there
Mm.
either.
Mm.
Mm. And one has to trust that the lines are taut enough to carry them.
Mm. And sometimes they're not.
Mm.
But just digressing from the poem and coming back to how you used a term of art for the title, and we spoke a little bit about how in another life you might have been an artist, and the importance of ekphrastic poetry for you. Your poetry references words that relate to art quite a bit. Can you say something about how your poetry is influenced by or connected to art?
As a child, I was surrounded by art and literature, thanks to my mother. So the two were merged for me always. My fascination with both has travelled along parallel tracks.
Mm.
But it's an unconscious thing. I haven't been as conscious of it until doing this book. Mm.
Okay. Would you like to read another poem?
Well, change of register here. Blackbird. the enduring song of a blackbird in the rain, just before the rain or just after. The lilt and rhythm with its soft pauses rests on treble clefs of leaves, sings true his father's song each year. Through the window watching, I resist the long white winter light of absence and people it with trees. Let the air between their barren staves fine-tune the birdsong to a middle C and breathe. A scroll of sunset cloud unfurls its messages from foreign gods. Let fall soft parachutes of rain. Blackbird is silent, buttressed in his own green-black leaves.
So I often wonder with poems, and it's lovely that you have, readers wondering, which is the whole idea, I suppose, of a poem, that there's room there for the reader. Whether the poem, in this case, for example, is a snapshot of a moment in time, or whether it's a metaphor for something else.
I think it's both.
Mm.
It's definitely a snapshot of a moment in time, but it's a metaphor for coping with absence, for dealing with longing, with searching for a meaning in things. So what is the meaning of the blackbird in the rain? And the echoes. I'm always fascinated that we've lived here in this particular place for 30 years and generations of blackbirds all seem to sing the same song. So they've learned from their father, each or mother, each batch of fresh blackbirds to get to very mundane things. And yet there's that alien world that they are living in because we cannot communicate with them. They can, in a way, communicate with us.
Mm.
And then the poem also has a musical underpinning. It's written on staves, the sound going up and down the treble clefs and the silences and the pauses.
Yes. So there's more going on than first meets the eye. There is a superstition that regards blackbirds as messengers of the dead. Are you invoking that superstition in the poem?
I was not aware of it.
I was neither. I looked it up.
Right.
I don't know much about blackbirds, so I found that. I thought it was very interesting. And I didn't know also that blackbirds typically like to sing after rain. Was that something you knew?
No, that wasn't.
Amazing what you see. You got me off doing a little bit of homework when I read these parts.
And
So
you're explaining my poem to me. Thank you.
So you start the poem with the blackbird singing the rain, just before the rain and after rain, and then end the poem with it raining and the blackbird silent. And there may not be an answer to this, but what has happened to curtail the blackbird's song?
It's as though things are too much for him. He's retreating. He's not going to say.
Another silence, I suppose.
Another silence.
Yeah.
He's inscrutable.
Yeah. And you've touched on this, but why does the narrator of the poem resist the long white winter light of absence?
Because it's too hard. One can confront the absence. You can resist it. You can retreat from it. And I suppose this is a retreat into a little world. So I often see each poem as its own world of song and silence, which is comforting, and that helps resist the long white winter light of absence, I suppose.
Yes, I thought of that as comforting too. The kind of the comfort in music and in trees and birds and nature. And I love this scroll of sunset cloud unfurling its messages. Soft parachutes of rain, beautiful turns of phrase there.
Thank you.
What have you got for us next?
Talking about that invisible poem, there've been many versions. And I think the lesson I've learned from this poem is not to share work until you really are really sure that it's final. Because I shared it and it got altered by me so many times that I completely lost track of it. I lost its form, I lost its feeling, I lost touch with it. So I began all over again. And all I had for this poem was the line that is its title, "The Mute Dove of Distant Places." And it's a line I encountered in a particular translation of the Book of Psalms by a scholar who's not a religious person, but a scholar of ancient languages. And he'd gone back to the original languages of the Psalms. Often they begin with an instruction to the singer of the psalm on how to sing it. And this one, the instruction is unique to Psalm 52, and it said, to be sung like the mute dove of distant places. And this phrase totally stumped Robert Alter, this wonderful translator. And he thinks it's so old, it comes from really, really ancient times in the Bronze Age. Now sing, the psalmist was told, like the mute dove of distant places. Tell the story of the world, or life, or the past, or maybe just the story of right now. But the dove was careless and also very careful, full of trust and distrust. It was quiet for a long time. I sat there listening to its quiet. Its quiet was large and fulsome, comfortable, like pillows, like my mother. The dove was lonely and the blackbird had stopped singing. A small wind stirred the tree's new leaves. The dove eyed me silently, then forgot me, flew off. I can't fly. I'm stuck here, listening for the blackbird, waiting for the meaning of a dove to be delivered like an egg in a nest, unopened.
Well, I haven't seen all the previous versions, but I think this one you've nailed it.
Oh, good. That's a relief. I can discard those drafts.
It is an extraordinary phrase, the mute dove of distant places. And you invoke the mystery of the phrase in a kind of mystery in a poem, which again is something that a reader can dive into and walk around in and think about and wonder. I'm wondering how the dove can be careless and careful at the same time and full of trust and distrust at the same time. That's got me puzzled.
Mm. Well, just watching the way they waddle made me think of that. And then I began playing with the words, I suppose. Careless, careful, trust, distrust.
And the quiet for a long time is another kind of silence, and you're listening to that silence.
Expecting something.
Yeah, but it's nice that it's large and fulsome, comfortable, like pillows, like my mother. It feels like a nice place to be in, waiting for that, listening to that quiet. At the beginning of the poem, you say, tell the story of the world or life or the past, or maybe just the story of right now. Is that, if you like, your kind of poetic manifesto, that it's sort of, this is what your poetry is about?
Oh, now there's a thought.
It's a big undertaking, but it doesn't have to be. It can be a small undertaking. It's the story of right.
Yeah, I could embrace that as a manifesto. Thank you.
And once again, we have a blackbird that stopped singing. All your blackbirds stopped singing for some reason. The entry into the silence, so the muteness of the dove that the narrator's listening to, is that silence an opportunity, like that the narrator can insert her own meaning into it?
Yes, because it is so ambiguous and so obscure and so open, mysterious. So that's why it can encompass the story of the world or life or the past or the story of right now.
I'm interested in the quietness of the dove and the blackbirds stop singing. So what you've got here is silence upon silence. There's a doubling of silences, the silence of two birds. Did you have any particular objective in doubling up silence in this way?
No, it was a bit odd, I suppose, to introduce the blackbird again. I suppose it's just the way the poem traveled and the way one sits waiting for the meaning to clear itself, and it doesn't. To wait for the meaning to be understood, to be delivered like an egg in a nest, but it remains there unopened. It doesn't hatch. It doesn't develop. It remains other.
As a reader, when I read haven't thought about this a lot, but when I read a collection of poetry, it's like entering into a world and you find that there are denizens of that world. So, you know, the denizens, and it's kind of nice when they keep reappearing. So, you know, the denizens here are clouds and silence, but also this blackbird that keeps popping up. So as a reader, I enjoy that correspondence between the poems and the book, on you know, with the denizens of the book appearing here and there.
Yes, I think those links are clearer thanks to the help I got through Liquid Amber Press's wonderful Rose Lucas, who helped me edit what would have been a much larger book down to a smaller collection. And so these links between poems became more evident. Some of the poems I'd submitted had been postcards, but they were really different worlds to this world that I'm in ways to say goodbye.
I think a lot of writing, for me anyway, isn't all that conscious, so that I don't see the links between my works until someone points them out sometimes.
Yes, and in fact, it's only when I sequence a collection that I see those themes. That I see. I'm not conscious of them, no, when I write them.
All right, what's next?
Next is, it's almost become a cliche to write about Walter Benjamin's Angel of History, which was a painting he'd acquired from his friend Paul Klee, called Angelus Novus. And wherever Walter Benjamin stayed, he kept this painting on the wall. And when he had to flee the Nazis, he gave this painting to his philosopher friends to take care of. And part 2 of the poem picks up at the point where that painting is now in a museum behind glass. But I'll just say something a little ahead of that. When Walter Benjamin died on his journey from Germany to aiming for Spain, he died in a little Catalan town and took his own life there because he thought he was going to be captured. And eventually people put a tomb there for him, and it carries these words: "There is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism." Walter Benjamin had been writing a treatise on history, and so this painting that he called the Angel of History was emblematic for him, I think, of that unfinished work. Anyway, I enter into a conversation with this Angel of History, and so the poem is called Conversations with the Angel. Clay had called the poem, the painting, Angelus Novus. Angelus Novus in the starving light as a painting of disaster. How could you be so beautiful? Soundless behind glass, confined, meaning pruned to a minimum, volume dialed down, dressed for departure. You step from the railway station into a carriage alone, on your way to a nowhere we haven't yet decided on. The sound of your footsteps remains in the air. And in the air, so much ashen dust as could fill a cooling tower. The wrecking ball weighs black against a blue-veined sky and adds up to a poem about a storm and a loss of consciousness. Angelus Novus, what have you to say about the wrecking ball and all the dust around you? What wordless words fall, fail, flail, flesh fled around you? Wait for me, I'm trying to understand. Can I borrow your vision? Angelus Novus in the still point of the storm, I can't see beyond the next sentence. The cock crows 3 times. Denying you doesn't help one bit. You're still there the next morning with your angel wings around me. Your cheeks red hot against mine. You show me your face as if I must take courage from merely seeing you. But what action do you want? And do mere words count? In what country are we now? Is this the world? Sorrow heaped on sorrow, heaped on sorrow. In your dusty wings, the filaments of someone else's faith, the artist's paint, burnt, amber. And still I cannot hear your voice. When I wake, it's morning, and no stars shine. Kyrie eleison.
I almost feel like we could devote an entire podcast to this poem. There's quite a lot. There's quite a lot in it. Were you tempted at all to have an image of the painting in the book?
I hadn't thought of it, but it would have been interesting.
Because I was not familiar with it, so I Googled it and looked it up. It's not what I expected.
No, I think the first part of the poem calls it a tiny screaming panicked angel.
Yeah. So this poem is in a section of your book titled Various Angels. Angels are a recurrent motif in this book. And you've told me that your next book will be gathering together various angels. Would you like to say something here about the importance of angels in your poetry?
Well, over the years, they've arrived in the poems, and I suppose they are the messengers of silence that speak. I'm not saying that I see visions and see angels. I don't. But they arrive in the poems and speak in the poems, or just occupy the poems. A dear friend in South Africa, the poet Robert Berold, pointed out that the poet Raphael Alberti has a wonderful book called Concerning the Angels, and so I've been reading that, and I suppose this will be the first of my conversations with angels.
Can you pinpoint a time when the angels first started turning up?
I know there are some in my 2001 book, Isolated States.
So they've been around for quite a long time then.
Yes.
Can you say something about how you came across this piece of art and how the poem emerged from it?
Oh, well, I was doing a thesis about youth mental health in terms of my son. And I came to read a book about trauma by two Holocaust survivors, Dori Laub, and I can't remember the other person's name, in which they quoted the Walter Benjamin words about the angel of history being blown forward by time and looking back on the 20th century's crimes and disasters and catastrophes. But the angel's inevitably blown forward. And I wasn't aware how commonly used this patch of Walter Benjamin's is, and actually how very many poets have written about it, one of whom is Rachel Duplessis. Anyway, so that's what sparked my interest.
There were, in this section of the poem that you read, a lot of questions. It's titled Conversations with the Angel, but it's really one-sided conversations of the narrator, isn't it? Because there is no response to the narrator's questions.
No response. Yes. What have you to say? I'm just nervous about the wrecking ball and all the dust around you.
Yes, and many other questions besides, all of which remain unanswered. Do you think this is primarily a lament for the history of the 20th century, sorrow heaped on sorrow heaped on sorrow? Or did you mean it to be more than lament? And if so, what else is it?
It is a lament, and it's not just the 20th century, but the times we're living through now. And it's a lament with a feeling of impossibility. Do mere words count? And yet the angel is comforting and puts his or her wings around me, and I feel the warmth of that comfort, but it's a silent comfort. So it's a striving to understand. I could also say it's about faith and the loss of faith and battling with faith and dealing with faith in the face of catastrophes and impossible questions and not knowing answers.
I mean, there are many poems in this book that are in some way or other about grief and loss and catastrophe, but there seem to be quite a few instances of comfort from different sources in this book too. Can you talk a bit about that, about this, if you like, the insertion of comfort in the face of grief?
Oh, well, it's a very real thing that I think both my husband and I have experienced a merciful comfort through people, through various sources. So and through that one does take courage to write, to work. My husband's a photographer, and that's a great source of comfort to him, his work as a photographer. The filaments of faith are in the artist's brush. It seems to be a reality of our world that we must find ways to deal with sorrow, heaped on sorrow, heaped on sorrow, and find the comfort where we do.
One of the primary functions of poetry is to ask questions, as this poem does, without necessarily proffering any answers. And I've already mentioned that the questions in this poem don't have any answers. And the anguish in this poem doesn't have an answer really either. At the end of it, there is only Kyrie eleison, I don't know how to pronounce that, Lord have mercy.
Mm.
And that's the answer in a way.
That is the answer. It's just Lord have mercy. Mm.
Yeah, I like this. Lots to think about in this poem. Would you like to read another one?
The title of this poem requires an explanation. Now, it's not the word mandala. It's the word mandola, which in Italian means almond, and it's a shape. I've got a picture here. So that is a mandola, the almond shape formed when two circles overlap, and it's used in spiritual contexts as a way of uniting opposites, bringing unity from things that are very disparate. And a lot of medieval art uses the mandola and places a religious figure in the center. So anyway, here is my mandola. In a kind of torpor, I constructed a mandola. It's 3 doors open to perception. I placed you in the center, dressed in white. At your side, 2 angels guarded you from harm. In your hands were needles, pens. You said you needed them for believing in the afterlife. I couldn't follow what you said. Was it leave me or believe me? That was all you said. I could have felt rejected. But later someone told me you had loved me. I'll believe that. In the same way some believe that bread and water can keep a soul alive.
So this poem introduces part 4 of your book, which is titled Ways to Say Goodbye. Do you want to say something about the poems in this section of the book and about the silence that they are addressing?
Well, they get closer to dealing with the particular issue of grief I'm dealing with. It also echoes, I suppose, that earlier poem I read, Chiaroscuro. In fact, it was written at the same time. So it's a more dreamlike poem. It's its own little world. It's an image of a figure with 2 angels guarding them from harm. And there's this issue of mishearing or misunderstanding. So did you say, leave me? Did you say, believe me? And being ambivalent about being loved. I could have felt rejected, but later someone told me you had loved me. I believe that in the same way some believe that bread and water can keep a soul alive. Change of tone, I suppose, into the more difficult poems at the end of the book.
The way you showed the mandola, it's like a very contained space, a kind of designated space. You could call it a space between, if you like.
Yes.
And I just wondered if this poem is a poem about the space between life and death, the space between arrival and departure, or about some other kind of space between.
I think you're right. I think it is the space between life and death. And between what sustains us on a worldly level and what sustains us spiritually. And the importance of reaching for an understanding. So trying to work out. So the mandorla has its 3 doors open to perception. There are many ways to look at it, I suppose.
Mm. Well, one way I looked at it was that the space between is a space where the narrator is trying to hold on to something that has already vanished.
Mm. Yes. And that is all one's left with.
Mm. Is what the narrator places in the center of the mandorla a physical being or a spiritual being or a memory or something else?
I think it's a memory.
Yeah.
I think it's a composite. It's attempt to understand something through making a shape of it and making words of it. And then there are these needles and pens in case one can write back their words, but they're not really heard. So yes, it evaporates at the end.
So it's just like reaching into the mist.
Yes.
Yeah.
And again, it's a poem that writes itself, I suppose.
Mm.
I think I wrote it almost without correction.
Which is unlike you, isn't it?
Fairly. I'd say of the poems I write, maybe 1 out of 10 is a successful poem. And then of those, maybe 1 out of 10 is one that writes itself. So they are quite rare.
Yeah. All right. Do you want to read another one?
Well, this is a big change in register. When our son died, my husband and I said to each other, look, let's not torture ourselves with saying, if only this or only that. If once a looking glass. For some reason, I called the poem that, and I don't know why I called it that, but if once a looking glass. All the if-onlys came to live with me today. They set up camp and began talking. They told me if only I had known this and that, and if only I had seen this and that, and if only I had tried this and that. Then they arranged all of this and that in groups, like a maths equation, and showed me how they all added up. But like a child, I put my hand into their puzzle and muddled up the pieces. They reassembled, mounted an exhibition in glass cases, called it the relics of the if-only worshippers. The if-only's glass cases were on a table, and inside them swilled a kind of liquid air, like plastic you could see through, in which the if-onlys floated like a gel I had eaten. They were inside me and were choking up my inward systems, misguiding me. How could I demount the exhibition and undigest it all safely so I would not swallow glass? If I put my hand into the liquid plastic air, I might turn into an exhibition myself. I might freeze forever. I began to feel cold. The chill advanced from my feet as it does in winter on London streets. A wind crept up and bothered me, a little wind, blowing pages and pages, blowing black and white photographs of Marilyn Monroe. My knees, and especially my arms, began to fail. It was all I could do to stand. All about me was night. I leaned in to a wide-angle lens, smiled as wide as this. I was aware of a line of equal signs on the tarmac, lining up to take off. Me with my hair oiled and varnished for the crowd. How he sang, if only you'd been there.
I was intrigued by you saying that you're not sure why you called it what you did, because I immediately thought of Lewis Carroll and his novel Through the Looking Glass and Alice in
Yep.
Wonderland, where Alice steps through a mirror into a fantastical world where everything is reversed. And I was wondering whether there were correlations between this poem and that novel.
Well, maybe my subconscious knew that and did that, yes.
I thought
I have referenced Lewis Carroll in previous books, so it's a definite influence.
There you go.
And I like letting a poem be wacky if it wants to be. So if it starts going its own crazy direction, I let it. And this one I let go. So there it ended.
Well, when I saw, I was aware of a line of equal signs on the tarmac lining up to take off. It just seemed very much like Lewis Carroll, kind of Lewis Carroll kind of idea there. But you mentioned that, you and your husband tried to actively dissuade the if onlys from taking up residence. I've always thought that the if onlys are a form of torture, of endless self-castigation. But I wanted you to read this poem because I think we all ask ourselves that question about all sorts of things, and I'm sure it resonates with everyone. I felt that there was a movement through this poem of the narrator's relationship with the if onlys. First, they come and take residence or occupation. Then the narrator muddles up the pieces. Then they reassemble into an exhibition, and it goes on from there. Can you take us through the different stages of the narrator's relationship with the if onlys in this poem and what happens to it?
Yeah, well, that's right. And then there they are in a perfect exhibition space in glass cases, which seems to have contained them. But they're actually not a solid thing. They're like a gel, and then the poem goes from word to word to word in a sequence. So it's a gel I had eaten. I'd eaten them. They were inside me. They were inside me. They were choking up my inward systems. My inward systems are choking. I'm misguided. And now I'm misguided. How can I demount the exhibition? So there's a chain reaction happening. Not confront, but accept or ingest these if onlys. They do something inside you. And how can you deal with them safely? Because it's as if you've swallowed glass. And if I put my hand into the liquid plastic air, I could turn into an exhibition and freeze and become frozen in time in that exhibition's race. I could freeze forever, and then I begin to feel cold. So the chain reaction continues. And then the poem just continued itself on its merry journey in a London street, making the narrator colder and colder. And the wind causes some chaos, and the narrator attempts to recover their balance. Things take off.
Yeah.
There we are.
Yeah. It's kind of like a domino.
It's a domino. It's a domino poem. But the interesting thing, you've reminded me in something that you said a few minutes ago. I read this at a poetry festival, and a poet came up to me and said, "Thank you so much for that poem. It's really helped me deal with something." And off she went, and I don't know what she was dealing with, but she'd obviously been dealing with some if onlys. So
yeah,
I felt that poem had accomplished something in its life.
Yeah. I love poetry that veers off into the unexpected and does a few bizarre things, like you say, and demands something of its readers. And I had that feeling in this poem veered off to black and white photographs of Marilyn Monroe. I have to tell you, I did not see that coming.
Nor did I.
And I thought that was capturing something in stasis, like a moment frozen in time but recognizable to everyone. Is that what the line's trying to do, or is it just one of those lines that have their own mystery about them?
Perhaps both. Perhaps both. It's an iconic photograph of Marilyn Monroe with her on the street with her dress and the wind.
And it's frozen in time.
It is frozen in time and it's the past. But something's lined up waiting to take off. So it becomes like a surreal dream.
Yeah.
And I think if you let the poem free, people call the result surrealism, but it's actually just free association. And if the free association makes sense, well, then you're fortunate and the poem works. And it doesn't descend into nonsense.
Yeah, there is a surrealistic flavour about it, isn't there?
Yes, at the end. Well, perhaps at the beginning too, yes.
Yeah, I think throughout. I can't decide, and maybe I don't have to, what you mean by the lines, I leaned into a wide-angle lens, smiled as wide as this. It brings to mind something from Through the Looking Glass. I'm not sure what. But I'm not sure whether to interpret it as a kind of forced rictus of a smile, or of a smile saying, I have vanquished the if-onlys. Can you say something about your intention behind those lines?
I think it's a forced smile. I don't think it's a vanquishing.
Oh, that was me being optimistic.
I think it's a posing for the camera, and Marilyn composing for the camera, all oiled and varnished for the crowd. If it's Marilyn, if it's the narrator, if it's
whoever it is.
Whoever it is. And I don't like to pin the eye of the poem down to me. So, yeah.
Yes, I've been referring to the narrator of these poems rather than...
Thank you.
I read the last line, if only you'd been there, not as a wistful thought, but as utter devastation.
Yes, it comes full circle back to the beginning, doesn't it?
It does.
And it's a change of register too, I think.
To me, it kind of exemplifies what poetry can do in a few words. It can be a gut punch just in a few words like that. You've told me that your earlier work was influenced by Pao Shalan. Would you say that about this line? It seems to be something like out of his oeuvre.
I wouldn't have made that connection myself, but that's interesting. For me, I think the influence of Ceylon is a deep one, and one I'm still trying to explore. It's such a narrowed down vocabulary that he delves into so deeply. That's part of the fascination for me. And again, of course, the silence and absence and white space and wordless words that fascinates me.
All right, I think you have one more poem for us, which is the last poem in the book.
This poem I'd struggled with for 9 years.
Wow.
It was a long poem. And then one day I realized that I was talking about two separate griefs. And once I cut this part of the poem free from the long poem, I was left as if with the material that you're making into a coat or dress or material. I then had the material for a poem that I could really work with. I allowed some of the facts from the real world to morph and change. I slightly changed a few things that had happened in reality and allowed the poem then to just find itself. And the final thing I allowed was, or discovered for the poem, was to pour it into the form of a sonnet.
Mm.
And once I had made it a sonnet, I could really work with it. I don't often work in form. I would like to work in form more, but I'm probably, am I lazy? I have arguments with dear friends about formalist positions. But anyway, enough of all of that. Red Angel. She's from the country of angels, I could tell. Her shadow behind her like a dark door. Her hands were cupped as if waiting to receive a globe, as if she were about to be Atlas and to carry my pain. Hesitant, but finding me, or at least my shadow, waiting, she touched my forehead with blessing. It was some kind of comfort in an empty church on a weekday afternoon. No priest she was, and I, no Catholic, had come to light candles. I'm just on an errand, she'd said, to buy a red bowl. I hold and she empties my red story of loss, witnessed by birds in the rafters. Outside, as she leaves, her footfall is soundless.
So I kept reading this poem over and over, and the more I read it, the more I liked it. It just it sang to me. So I don't know what the original was that, you know, it's been extracted from, but it, for me, this is actually the perfect way to end a book. Because there is an element of uplift and comfort in this poem, and it's always nice to end a book, I think, in that kind of tone. And you've said that your next book's going to be about angels, so it's a bridge. It segues beautifully into that, doesn't it?
Mm.
Do you think the space between is also a space inhabited by angels and ghosts?
Oh, definitely. Well, look, it's that space between waking and sleeping. And I think I write in that space. In fact, I have to write in that space because otherwise I'm too self-conscious. So it's that liminal, mysterious space, but you can't invoke it. So, okay, I can set up the conditions where I could be in that meditative space, but I can't then force the poem to appear. I can't force the angel to appear.
Mm.
Mm.
Mm. And there's something almost mystical in this poem. And I suppose that sort of invocation of angels does that a little bit. I'm interested in the angel finding the narrator's shadow waiting. Is this the shadow in psychological terms, representing everything the conscious personality experiences as negative? Is that?
Yes, it's the angel. Does the angel encounter me or the shadow? So in the Jungian sense, yes.
Mm.
Yes.
And the fact that the shadow is waiting to be found suggests to me that the narrator has reached a threshold in the process of grieving and loss, like she can say goodbye, like she has permission now to let go. Is that what you're saying?
I think you're right. I think you're right. One of the sections of the book is called Thresholds.
Mm.
Interestingly, this poem has been recently chosen to end another book. And it's the first ever Routledge International Handbook on Drug-Related Bereavement. I took part in an email intervention for bereaved people 16 years ago when our son died, and it was being conducted out of Utrecht at the university. And recently wrote to the researchers there to thank them for that email intervention because it had helped me so much. And through that, I started a conversation with this wonderful researcher who was putting this handbook together. She was at the end of editing the handbook, and she said, "Do you have a poem for me that we could use to end our handbook with? Because it would be nice to end the handbook with a bereaved person's words." And so that's where the Red Angel has ended up at the end of that book.
I mean, I find this too. Poems have their own lives, don't they? And
They
they
do.
go their own directions that you never see
Yes.
coming, which is
Yes.
all part of the fun of sending them out there in the first place.
They live their own lives.
They do. I found the symbolism in the cupped hands. It's almost religious, but you're saying I'm no Catholic. The narrator is no Catholic. The hesitancy, the blessing, the kind of comfort. It's all hopeful. The emptying of the red story of loss suggested to me a transference of pain and a kind of absolution. It's not necessarily religious, but it does seem spiritual. Can you say something about your writing of this poem, how it came to you and how you feel about it?
I heartily endorse your explication. It is a poem of transference, of change, of transaction, a transaction where something is altered. You have the reality of the grieving person in the church and the encounter with the other that confers comfort. So there's the receiving of the comfort, but there's also the conveying of the pain. The angel's able to hold that pain, that impossible weight. And yet the angel can leave as light as a leaf at the end. So it's not a burden. It was a lovely feeling to have finished that poem and know that it was its own thing. I didn't need to tinker with it forever.
So maybe it took you 9 years to be in a position to relinquish some of that pain. Maybe it took you 9 years to write the poem because it needed to take you 9 years to write
it needed to take 9 years. I could not have written it quickly. It could not have happened. It couldn't have been one of those instant poems, no.
Thank you so much, Anne, for sharing your poems and exploring your experiences, thoughts and insights on the theme of silence and the space between. It's been a wonderful conversation.
Well, thank you so much for your very deep reading and for this special time. And I've really enjoyed speaking with you. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Details of Anne's books and where to get them will be posted with this podcast, so please look out for them. Poets Corner will return, well, in a month or so. We're recording them monthly, but they're taking a while to get posted, with Kevin Brophy, who I've said that once before, had to change the lineup a little bit. So we've inserted Anne in front of Kevin, but we'll be coming back with Kevin Brophy, reading poems and talking on the theme of out of place. See you then.